is Indigenous outside of Turtle Island and Abya Yala, which I am still butchering probably, and I apologize. Um, that is a very racist comment that you just made there. And we don't, again, deal well with racism in my space, other than to, of course, maybe discuss how inappropriate it is. So I deal with it like that. And your racism showed more than any proof that you think you have that race, a theory created by the field that I am a member of and debunked by the field that I am a member of, exists. Thank you very much. Again, culture and ethnicity absolutely exist, but culture and ethnicity have nothing to do with the bell curve, mofo. Hey, beautiful. Oh, I'm trying to get out a couple more. Sorry, I'm just kind of sitting down and get myself put together just because, like I said, the last minute the dog decided that he needed to use the restroom. So I want to make sure that we understand going in that today's live is devoted to Indigenous groups outside of North and South America for the purpose of bringing that understanding everywhere. Tomorrow we will be having a live, most likely, I think, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, my time. I'll put up a live event for it that will discuss issues within North and South America, within Turtle Island and Abya Yala. Please correct me. So please understand that there's definitely going to be plenty of people of many different ethnicities on this panel, but it is focused on outside of Turtle Island. So understand that coming from my heart is why you will not be invited in the panel today. There are a few people that are so lovely that have been willing to. Rosie, it says you're unavailable. Can you not go live right now? Oh, okay. I'll let you hide in chat. There's Sleepy. And I'm trying to make sure. I don't know if I have. No. I'm trying to see if there's anybody else. I do know that there's a couple of people who are going to be coming in at different times just because of time zones. And so hopefully there will be other people in as well, though Sleepy is a wonderful addition always. I did want to start with what it is to be Indigenous. I think that what is listen, again, I'm not dealing with racism. And to me, racism includes erasure. You need to go bye-bye. I just blocked him. When we're looking at what it is to be Indigenous, it is, to me, hugely about a people who have lived in a space for a long period of time that have developed a interaction with the space. I think that the UN's list of what it means to be Indigenous actually has a lot of understanding to it and actually gives a lot of depth to that to me. And so for me, this works really well. I do believe that there are a lot of people around the world that fit the UN's list that are not on the UN's list. And I do not find that to be acceptable to me. And I do believe that it's important to recognize the different groups around the globe that are fighting for recognition. Many spaces around the globe are still fighting for recognition as Indigenous people. It is important to understand that outside of the United States, Indigenous and Native are two different things. Outside of the United States, to be Indigenous is to fit the list back here behind me, and inside, to be Native is to be a member, um, a member of a group who founded a country as the dominant group in that space. So take the Swedish and the Sami. The Sami are an indigenous people. The Swedish and the Sami both move into this space from the lower and the upper roughly the same time. And they take quite some time before they're meeting in the middle. So they're not really meeting each other right off the bat. Not that there's not interaction, but I mean like land meeting. To my understanding, from what I'm reading, that might not be completely, that might be the wrong understanding. I will take accountability if I am mistaking that. But that is from my understanding. So when the Swedish get to the point that they're founding a government, the majority of the people in that area, 51% of the population, meaning majority, is the present day Swedish population. And they found the government of that area. And so they are native to that area because they have been there since before the founding of that government, but they were the majority population and founded the government. So somebody who is Swedish would be native, while somebody is Sami who is Sami would be indigenous. This difference is important in places outside of the United States, outside of Canada. Outside of the understanding here within the Turtle Islands as well, I would say, but maybe more outside of those two spaces, just because I don't think indigenous and native like are the same in South America like they are here. I think that they might be different in the way they're understanding it as well. Just to clarify, Sleepy, who I'll let introduce themselves, is beautiful, wonderful cousin who has taught me so much. So I'll let them go ahead and talk.
Hi, pal. So, yeah, I'm Sleepy, like I guess. My real name's Jack. I don't really care if people know my real name. I live in Cymru, which most people know as Wales. It's attached to the UK. We prefer the term Cymru because Wales is actually the Anglo-Saxon word for foreigner or slave, which, how can you be foreigner in your own country? We were here first. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say.
That's fine. I just didn't want to introduce you. Like, I'll let you introduce who you are. And I've learned a lot about the fight going on within Cymru from you, Jack. And I think for me, there's a lot of things that I didn't really realize until we had talked about them, like the way history is taught, and the ongoing fight that's still there, right? And the fact that there has been, quite a bit of time that this is going on. That it's never really died out.
No, the first major invasion took place with the Romans in 43 CE. So there's pretty much been ongoing issues and things since then. I mean, the major colonization was the Anglos when they came in, and that's when they implemented and wiped out like the Celtic cultures within the space that is now called England. And you then had a lot more problems from the Norman invasions. And the Norman invasions, they invaded England in 1066, and we're talking earlier in the 1100s is when they put their onslaught into Wales. And they're the group of people that were essentially murdered our own native royalty, our own princes, and our own hierarchy and powers that we had within our own culture. And we were officially conquered, and I think in law we were officially annexed during the reign of Henry VIII. We didn't actually legally have our own recognition as our own country again, I think, until 2011, which is a long, long time. But we've always maintained aspects of our culture. We have our own language. which was absolutely made illegal and beaten out of our children, over the course of a few hundred years, to the point that we have a population of about 3 million people. 2 million people will identify themselves as being Welsh, whether that's by nationality or identity. And we only have within Wales around about 900,000 fluent Welsh speakers. So it's never been on the extinction list, but it did diminish quite low down. And thankfully, because we do have some devolved powers, we have been able to implement safeguards in place to encourage the use of language. And that has grown a huge amount. It's gone from something like, I think it was around about the 20% mark about 4 years ago to about 23-24% now. So it's growing at an exponential rate. So their aim is to get like 1 million fluent speakers by 2030, I think, or 2050. I think we're going to hit that target.
Well, that was wrong.
Rosie says, teach us your way of teaching languages, because over here it is a nightmare to learn any. So the general way in which, I'm going to say this lovingly, English-speaking countries, so any country that speaks English as a predominant language, like the Americas, like American English is a variation of English. Generally, the way in which most languages is taught through a lot of ignorance of, why do we need to learn other languages? It's never going to be useful. We already speak English, most people speak English. It's quite a lot of arrogance there as well. And the way in which they tend to teach languages is through sitting in a classroom, learning, lists of words, repeating, learning grammar. And it's not a way in which I can learn language very well. I did not do well with languages in my own schooling experience. And very few people learn languages well that way. But if you take other examples, like the Japanese, and the Chinese and various places and cultures there that learn English to a very good degree, to basically to fluency. The way in which they do that is by immersion. They immerse people in the language. So when it comes to learning Welsh here, learning the Welsh language, which is Cymraeg, we actually have a fantastic opportunity that very few places in the rest of the UK have, and that is we have Welsh medium schools. These are schools where our children are actually just totally immersed in the language. They learn every subject except, I think, English in high school. They learn all those through the medium of Cymraeg. So my son, who is 4.5, he's currently in nursery. He's just gone to have his first part year at school, and he's going to a Welsh medium school. So by the time he will be, on average 6 to 7, will basically be fluent in Cymraeg. He will know English from speaking English at home with me, but that is, in my opinion, the best way to learn a language. Now, interestingly, here in Cymru, all of our English-speaking schools now have to teach Cymraeg up to a first language level. So every person coming through the school system is expected to be able to speak Cymraeg fluently by the time they leave high school. So, but yeah, the two different teaching styles, and I absolutely approve of the immersion, because on one hand, I am absolutely for, saving our culture, saving our language, and doing all these fantastic things to keep us connected. But at the same time, I don't want to go so far in the other direction that we end up creating a lot of trauma, because there are people who are learning the language and feel that the language is being forced on them. And I have friends who are a little bit older than me that hated learning Cymraeg at school because of the way they felt it was pushed. So there has to be a balance, and I think introducing it at a very young age, when brains are like sponges, is probably the best thing.
I agree. I know that for the Swedes, actually, they teach English in their schools. So they learn Swedish at home and all that, but they teach English in all their schools as a first language. So like they most of them speak really fluently in English. Like it's not even so much a second language for them. So I think that immersion and that like really being involved in it is really important, especially from a young age. They proved like I think 30, 40 years ago that our best language learning time is prior to 5 years old, right? So if
So somewhere between the age of like 2 and 6 is
yeah,
like the optimum time to start learning a language, when your brain has done less pruning. The autistic people in the room will understand brain pruning and stuff like that. Somebody's mentioned autistic people in the thing. We are the neurospicy crew here tonight, I think.
it is pretty spicy. I would agree. Yeah. Um, well, and for me, like trying to learn another language as an adult, and then I learned Aramaic and Swedish or Aramaic and Hebrew at like 6 or 7, I think 7. But I never held on to it because it didn't stick around, like we didn't stay within that community. But um, for me, learning language as an adult was much harder. And I think that it's just really very important that I think that we incorporate more languages, period, right? Like, I think learning other languages has really only ever been of benefit to larger groups, especially for me, though, incorporating Indigenous language into spaces. Well, I think we should incorporate them into mainstream schools too here in the US, just because of the fact that that might help some people understand not to scream, go back where you came from.
All the language, I think, is really important. It's also not. It's not just about language itself, but it actually encourages brain development in certain areas. And languages is tightly connected to things like music and maths as well. So there are huge benefits to being able to speak another language. I totally suck at languages. Now I speak English fluently, of course. I speak a little bit of German, and I'm not even going to go as far as saying conversationals. I can go. I've been to Austria. I can basically get by describing what I need by color and size and a mixture of that. A bit of sign language, because there is universal signs for I need the toilet, even if you don't need, if you
Right.
don't know the actual words. But I actually speak more Canuic than I do Cymraeg, because my father's family is from Canal, and I'm learning to speak Cymraeg. I'm not a fluent speaker. I try and surround myself by other fluent speakers. I watch a lot of. We have TV here called S4C, which is a Cymraeg medium TV station. So they have their own soap operas, they have their own news stations, they even have Paw Patrol and Peppa Pig in Cymraeg for my son.
Awesome.
And I listen to a lot of Cymraeg music because you can pick up a lot of things through the medium of music. So
Yeah.
I do like. I like the idea of being able to speak Cymraeg, but I think that it's probably going to take me a lot longer than my son to learn. I'm learning a lot from him as well. I mean, the first time he came home and he was asking me for the toilets, but he was asking me in Welsh, and I had this major panic, and he's going, I want the tea bath. I'm like, what's the tea bath? I want the tea bath. And I'm like, what the hell's the tea bag? Go find the tea bag.
That's funny.
What's the toilet? I'm like, oh, okay. And then I actually went and spoke to one of his teachers about it. I'm like, I could have been prepared for this. But tea bags, really cool word actually. It means tiny house.
That's awesome.
So it basically goes back to the days when we used to have outhouses, the little houses out the back, out the side of your house, which was the lavatory.
I grew up with one. I know. I'd get punished and get sent to the outhouse when I was a child, actually. That was our timeout space. Mom said it was because there was no corners in the TV.
My mum used to send me upstairs and switch the upstairs fuses off, so I had no access to anything. But what she didn't count on the fact is I absolutely love reading. So
Yep.
I just consume books until it got too dark to read.
That makes total sense. I think the language reconstruction, or not reconstruction, but relearning and making sure that it's getting out and making sure that it's learned, especially on a young level, is probably to me one of the um, I see it over here a lot too, where there's a lot of effort put into it. It's one of the most beautiful things, because I think something that's said here frequently is that, speaking to your ancestors in the language that they understand, it rings to them, like it sings to them a little bit more. And to me, that's so important, right? To be able to speak to our ancestors if we, are following an ancestral path in a language that they can understand.
Yeah, and if you believe in any deities and things like that as well, communing in their language is probably a good idea. Although I'm sure most deities can understand silent language.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, the encouragement of the language is really important, and I think although I would absolutely love for to wake up tomorrow and see Cymraeg as an independent country away from everything and have connection to our culture and things, I think one of the most important things is also to take it slowly, and that's just because essentially there is a lot of acquiescence here in this country because over generations and generations, um, a lot of Khmer people have been indoctrinated to believe that English is the best, and we're doing okay. We wouldn't survive without them. It's educating and being patient with that educating, because the last thing you want to do is alienate people from your own country, who are Cymru, which is your fellow countrymen. That's what it literally means. Um, we want to make sure that everybody is comfortable and not just feeling cast out in their own lands. So, it's got to be a very, very fine balance in terms of independence. I know it will happen. As to when it will happen, that's another question. I think, a, a optimistic timescale would be 10 to 15 years. So, but that's going to be dependent on a lot of things. And I think, either Scotland or Northern Ireland will have to gain their independence first for there to really be the injection of motivation into what the independence movement here needs.
And I think that makes sense. I think that everything has to be handled really everywhere in a manner that is done with as much love for humanity and as much compassion for humanity as possible. I personally am an idealist in so many ways, and so in so many ways, I'm like, in a perfect world, it should be done as it could be in a perfect world. And so, yes, I mean, I think that, I also understand that for some people, my perfect world looks different than their perfect world, and that's how it's supposed to be, anyways. And so that's, perfectly tolerable to me as well. Uh, I think that for me, having, I think each space needs to understand how to make that happen on their own and understand with compassion how that is going to happen, right? I think that we can work together on a global level to um, deconstruct thinking that has caused problems, right? Without, anything that scares anybody or anything that, freaks people out or makes them think things are happening that aren't happening or all that other sort of stuff, right? Um, and I also recognize that when it comes to compassion and doing everything in the most loving ways possible, that it takes time. Like you cannot do anything quickly and do it with compassion of thought. I mean, I think that you can act with compassion in quick moments, right? But things that require any form of long term logic, you have to put thought into them to at least figure out what you're doing before you start moving. Just like
With a
you got to think before you
balance
speak,
of
kind of.
emotions. Yeah, it's got to come with a perfect balance of logic and emotion. You're not going to find it on just a purely emotional path. You're not going to find it on a purely logical path either. You have to find that balance to cause the least harm, but still achieve what everybody needs and what everybody desires. And sometimes that takes a lot of time. Like I say here, it's going to take the persuasion of people who have lived their entire lives. There's generations, the older generations, people in their 50s and 60s, that will literally stare me down and say, why are you talking Welsh? It's pointless language. It's gobbledygook. It's not needed. It's useless anywhere but Wales. And I will have people, literally Welsh people, not understand where that mindset comes from, and that's difficult. You have to treat them with compassion. If I go all guns blazing and just tell them they're wrong, they're just going to think that I'm some ignorant arse. Whereas if I open the discussion, if I have the spoons, if I open the discussion and ask them why they feel that way, and talk a little bit about the history and stuff, you have the opportunity to start changing minds. So we're fighting obviously an outside authority and an outside pressure, but we're also fighting a lot from within against people who don't really understand.
I think we see that here as well. And we see it in the live I was in right before here, we were talking about, distinguishing, and it was like, uh, instead of calling somebody who is indigenous a colonizer, I think was the original statement. And to me, it's like, you can say that everybody can have colonized thoughts or colonizer thoughts, right? Everybody can have bought into the ideology or bought into the doctrine, or not even bought in, but have it beaten into them, right? Which is so frequent, right? So I would say that bought in devalues the fact that it's beaten. So I don't want to say bought in on that level, right? So you have so many people that it's not. It is through trauma sometimes. It is through the way that you were brought up in love, even sometimes, right? The things that you were taught to love sometimes, right? So I think that it's important to understand. And I think it's important to understand, especially when it comes to our older generations, when it comes to this, because of the fact that there is so much trauma that so many older generations have gone through pretty much everywhere that I hear about. And I don't want to speak for anybody else or anything else either. But I know, especially here, or I know here that there's so much that the older generations have gone through that you have to understand and approach with understanding when you're trying to, address it, to talk about it, to maybe get them to see the different way of it, or accept their teachings that they're bringing to you because they have those teachings and, they should.
I'm of the mindset you only know something when you know something. So I'm of the mindset, as a general rule, most people have always done the best they could with the tools that they have. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it great. It doesn't make it good. But they did the best they could with the knowledge and the tools they had. If you look at, the boomers raising Gen Xers and the difference in between that and Gen Xers raising the millennials in general, obviously there are people like me that have boomer parents. And in fact, my dad's a silent gen. So, there are exceptions to those rules. People always did the best that they could with the tools that they had. Understanding the difference between knowing that you did the best you could and knowing that what you did wasn't necessarily right is the key difference. Not necessarily taking responsibility, but taking accountability. And, Cymru is a really good example of kind of like this as a country as a whole. It's like we've experienced colonization on one level, on several levels, through several different things. But at some point in history, we have also been a part of being the colonizers. Whether we wanted to be part of the British community or not, we were forced into that. And Britain played a huge part of the colonization of Turtle Island.
Right.
You know, and Wales are not exempt from that just because we were under the thumb of the English. We still participated, we still benefited from that. Understanding the difference and understanding and accepting the accountability of that is the important bit.
I agree. And I think that that's one of the things that I really see within you that I really love is that you're like, yeah, we're Indigenous and our sovereignty has matter and it has meaning. And I'm doing everything that I can to uphold that sovereignty and everything I can to uphold my ancestry. I can also recognize what my ancestry has done and make sure that I'm upholding other Indigenous voices, that I'm uplifting other Indigenous peoples who may have gone through the ringer in a different way or a little bit more, or, and I don't like more because it's comparative, but,
I hate comparative. I really hate comparative because I listened
right.
to the last live when you try to compare, you're trying to quantify. How can you quantify trauma? You can't quantify trauma of one person compared to the next. And the same is be said from one people's to another people's. And as soon as you start to quantify, it's not a huge leap before you start to try and justify. And you end up playing like the who got more hurt Olympics. And realistically, my generational trauma, my country's trauma, is nothing compared to Turtle Island's trauma, but their trauma is nothing compared to our trauma. It's all a circular kind of argument. They are not comparable because you need to take in so much to consider, like the times and the peoples and the hows and the who's and the whats, and it's just a case of that's just stupid to get into those arguments. You should just accept that we've both been through a lot, and you should recognize the differences, appreciate the similarities, to build this compassion for each other, and then uplift each other to fight the assholes that actually did it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like where I stand on that.
I agree with that. I don't like the comparison. I think that you can see where certain groups have gone through the same ringer. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that, because so often we tend to think we're the only ones going through this. Right. So do you think that that's important to acknowledge? I don't like the trauma Olympics at all, though. I think that how trauma affects each person differently. And that has to be set as a company scale too. So, or not company, country scale too. And so if, you're at a point where, the same thing is happening to two different spaces, it's going to affect each different space in a different way. It's going to call different things out and it's going to harm different things.
Yeah, and as much as you can build these like bridges of similarity, I call them bridges of similarities because I like the idea of connection, and you can build those to create compassion and empathy. It is also really, really important to distinguish the difference. Yes, I live in Cymru. We're facing a huge amount of issues politically, economically, on all these different levels. But I also know that even if I walked into England tomorrow, I'm not going to be murdered for being Welsh. I might have somebody throw slurs at me or take the piss out of me. Absolutely. There's a lot of xenophobia, particularly if I had a very broad Welsh accent. But I do not stand, run the risk of being murdered because of my identity. Well, not because of my Welsh identity anyway. There are various other reasons why somebody might actually want to, throw a stone at my head or something.
Yeah.
But that's the topic of conversation.
Intersectionality for the win. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And I have to say that it was not ever my intent to make it seem like the comparables are the same trauma or the different things that both, similar groups have gone through are the same trauma. Because I do not believe that at all.
No, I know that you don't. I know we've had these conversations. I know that you don't.
I know that I may not But I also know that sometimes I can say something that might make something come across a certain way, so I have to make sure that I've doubled down that that's not what my intent was ever, you know what I mean? Like
Understand that one as well.
ADD there.
Accountability all the way.
Right, right. To the core, to the core, to the core. Somebody told me I was gaslighting them today in TikTok, and I have been spending the last couple hours going, where would you think I was gaslighting you? Okay, maybe you think there, but that's only because you don't know me, and that's the pronoun I use. Like, what the fuck? Like, never mind, never mind.
You know what? If I use Welsh pronouns, that gets people even more confused because I go by she they. In Welsh, that is he I. So people go he. Hang on a minute, what? And it's just like, no, it's Welsh. It's Welsh. It means she.
Nice. That's funny. That's cool. That's a cool huh. That's a cool
It's quite patriotic.
translation.
Yeah. So,
Well, now I want to know where the word he comes from in English.
I don't know. I like linguistics. I do know little tidbits of information from linguistics, and I tend to collect that kind of knowledge, but I do not know where that comes. I know that man used to mean all adult humans.
Yep.
Girl used to be all human children. So,
Wow. Did the Anglo-Saxons steal it and misinterpret it and decide?
well, I mean,
Have we been calling he, she this whole time?
I'm trying to think of the evolution. In English, you've got modern English, you've got Middle English, then you've got Old English, and then you've got like, I think it's Proto-Germanic, and then probably Proto-Indo-European before that. But yeah, a lot of the way in which we name things, even though it might be German or Germanic language, the principle of naming things might actually be from a totally different culture. So, for instance, the names of the week, that's actually goes back to like Babylonian times, and the way that they observed like this, what they class as the 7 planets, and they decided, they observed like the moon took like 4 lots of 7 days to go through its cycle, and then they decided to name these 7 days after their 7 planets, which were aligned with their 7 deities. And then basically the Romans stole that, the Greeks stole that idea, but renamed them with their own deities. And then the Romans stole it from the Greeks and renamed them with their own deities. And then the Germanic people stole that idea from the Romans. And that's why you end up with Sunday, as in like the sun, Moon Day, which is like moon. And then there was Tuesday. I can't remember what
Tuesday is Tyr, and Wednesday is Woden.
Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day, and the only one they didn't have a deity for was Saturn. So they actually kept that from Roman.
Yeah.
Anyway, I went off on a bit of a linguistics thing.
No, that's really cool. I didn't know that that's where the naming of the days of the week comes from after the gods. I knew about, where we get ours currently, but I didn't know that they could trace the actual day week naming kind of thing back. Who did you say it was?
The Babylonians.
Babylonians. That's frigging epic. 1 second, I got a text. Okay. Sorry. That's pretty epic.
Hi, my name's Jack, and I'm a collector of useless information.
Hey, my name's Sarah, and I'm a collector of useless information. Then I pebble you with it. Have a pebble.
Absolutely.
Here's a pile of pebbles. They're just going to cascade down on you. You wanted to have your own pebbles? Sorry, I'm still giving pebbles. I can't tell you how happy I was when I understood that that's what that was. Oh, okay. I think it was you. Somebody did recently. It is a recent fact find, and I went. But then again, all of the stuff that's ND is a recent fact find for me because all of it's so recent, anyways, right? So all of it is, and then I remember once I started realizing, well, I think that I'm ADD, and once I started realizing it, I started watching videos, and I went, oh, okay. Oh, well, shit, that's why. Oh, well, okay.
Yep. So I was first set on the path of ADHD, which ADD is a subcategory. It's the inattentive type of ADHD. Um, 3 years ago, and then about a year later, the person I was talking to about this, who was a therapist, who basically said, "Oh, and by the way, I think you're autistic," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then I started going down that slope of, yeah, my life just slipped from underneath me. My life could have been so much easier if I'd just known this from the start.
That's the real. Well, and if I hadn't
So,
spent like decades believing that I was just useless and lazy and unable to,
yeah,
you
I
know,
just grew up thinking I was a shit human being.
yeah.
And the worst thing is when I asked my mother if she would be surprised if she found out that I was ADHD or autistic, she said no. And I'm like, well, take a second to think about it. She said, oh, somebody suggested it when you were a child, but and I'm just like, okay, why did you not get me, diagnosed? And she's like, well, it was labeled as a behavioural problem or a learning difficulty, which you weren't. I'm like, okay, I get that bit. Why did you not tell me? That's the bit that I do not understand.
I My mother actually was talking a couple years ago off of Facebook, and she was like, "I think I might have ADD." And I was like, and this was right when I started looking at it myself, and I was like, some of that stuff looks like me too. That makes sense. You might. And so she went and she didn't do anything about it. And then I got diagnosed, and I wasn't diagnosed before I stopped talking to my mother. I was diagnosed after I stopped talking to my mother. So I'm talking to my father after he talks to me again, finally. And I told him, I was diagnosed with ADD. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, your mother had that when she was a child." I had to go and look it up and see if it was actually a thing when she was a kid. I'll tell you the truth. I had to go and look it up and see if it was actually a thing when she was a kid. But apparently she had it when she was a kid and a teenager, and she was medicated for
Don't
quite
grow
some.
out of it. Yeah, you don't grow out of it.
Well, and
There was an ancient, well, I say an ancient, an old, you know, um, medical belief that once you hit 18, you grew out of it. It was only something that was, in children. And there are even really bad cases up until a few years ago where doctors have ceased to prescribe people's ADHD medication as soon as they've turned 18 because they're now 18, they're an adult, and it's just like, what? How can you? How can you be so stupid yet so smart? And what?
yeah. Yeah. Well, and my mom, I'm pretty sure, like, okay, so she's never before mentioned having been diagnosed when she was a child. Like when it was brought up before, she never mentioned it. So it wasn't that kind of, I think I might have it. And I never know with her. So I just figure. But I was like, listen, if you had it when you were a child, why the heck didn't you take me in when I showed signs of it? Because I know I've been showing signs this whole time, like why did you instead tell me, that it was this instead? Yeah. It was just like,
I just
whatever.
want to address a comment in the thing saying that most adult ADD can be tracked to vitamin B absorbing problems with the gut. So Um, just to be clear, ADHD is a neurodivergence. It's something that people are born with. It's not just in adults or just in children. Now, it is true to say that people with ADHD can have a vitamin B deficiency because they find it difficult to absorb things. But the way that that's worded is, it sounds as if you're saying that because you're lacking in the vitamin B, um, that's caused the ADHD. That's not true. Um, but yeah, vitamin B supplements are something that should be considered if you're lacking in those things because you have ADHD. Just wanted to make sure
That makes sense.
you're aware.
I did not know enough about it. And I knew it wasn't that, but I didn't know enough about it to comment on it because I do not know enough about ND yet at all, really myself. I'm still learning quite a bit. So
Well, if you ever want to pick someone's brains about it, I've been down this rabbit hole for 3 years.
I do pick your brains.
You do, I know.
Remember, I will now be using a touch of the tism because, I want to make sure that I'm using it correctly. Right? Or not correctly, but, being in the inclusive, person I want to try and be.
One of the things I love about talking to you is as much as we get on and whatever, I'm not afraid of like putting little corrections out there if I see them, because I know that you're never going to take it the wrong way. And I do honestly believe that holding your friends accountable for certain things is just as important as holding random other people on the internet accountable.
I would say more so.
Yes, absolutely.
For me, like, so it's hard for me sometimes with people because I really feel hyper criticized so often, not because, of anything that people I know do, but because of people I have known do, right? And um, so I do my best to make sure that I'm always open, right, to criticism because I um, also have watched a lot of people who are not open to criticism, right? And I don't like that. So I try and make sure, and for me, like what I like is, or what's comfortable for me is that I know that with you that you will correct me, but you're not, like angry at me or going to punish me or, things like that. So it's easy to take, right? I guess. Um, but yeah, I do think we should all be, well, and you said earlier, you know what you know until you don't know it no more to me. Then that's, I know you use different verbiage, but you know what you know until you don't know it no more. And all you can do is your best until you hear a different best, you know, and that's it for me is that's how correction should be taken is, you should always be learning anyways.
Rejection sensitive dysphoria is a very, very common thing amongst people with ADHD and autism. We can be hypersensitive to criticism and stuff like that. So, yeah, I understand trying to approach it from a very diplomatic kind of point of view as well. I try and say, even to people who I fundamentally disagree with, I try and say things with love because meeting people on levels of anger or possibly violence, it often doesn't garner the response that you need in that situation. So, um, but there are exceptions to everything. One of the best creators I've seen on TikTok to do with like sacred masculinity, or what I would deem as, and I'm assuming what you would deem as sacred masculinity. Um, I've sent you a few of his videos, so I know that you've seen him. He was brave enough to show a different side to himself on TikTok. He basically said that a Nazi showed up in his town with a sign. I can't remember what the sign said, but it was basically a very racist sign. And what he did was he went and made his own sign saying the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi, and stood in front of this guy. And when this guy, tried to like threaten him or whatever, he got big and he got loud and he followed this guy back to his car shouting and turned it into major kind of like, wow, I would not want to cross this guy.
That's awesome.
But he made people aware that there is a time and a place. And when people were pointing out, you don't know whether he was carrying something, and he's like, it's not a time to think about my own safety. It was time to think about the safety of the other people. I think it was something to do with Jewish people, because there were Jewish people in the community and whatever. I don't know. So, but yeah, I try as much as possible to use my words wisely.
Yeah. Well, and
Doesn't mean I'm a
I was saying earlier, like, I left our local protest community when I started realizing that I was so traumatized that I was not using my words in a way that was right or helpful. Because my personal trauma will start affecting the way that I talk. It will either, like, my brain will actually replace words. Like, I'll say purple when I mean green. Um, and it will also, like, I'll say whole strings of sentences that are not what was in my head. I don't know what it is. Also, I started stuttering at like 42 for the first time in my life because of extreme PTSD, right? So it just really affects the way that I speak. And so for me, I had to walk away and sit back when it came to a point that my words were traumatizing other people, right? And so I couldn't I couldn't I couldn't be in a space where I was going to cause trauma until I could deal with the trauma in my own head, and get rid of the trauma in my own head. Um, And so I stepped out. I think that it's important to recognize, when the shit that's traumatizing you, that when the trauma that you've been through is traumatizing others, to step back. And I think that's important as well when we're dealing with TikTok or just in average everyday conversation, that when you realize that I'm too irritable today, or I have something going on in my head today that's making me just not right today, it's important to step out of it. And I think that's the same when it comes to the movements that we have.
One of the biggest examples I can think of that in terms of having to take a step back and making sure that you're healthy of mind and whatever is when it comes to raising kids. You know, sometimes your trauma as a person can affect your ability to raise your kids because you're traumatizing them as a result. And this is something I had to think carefully about when I had my son, because I was raised in a toxic household, but it was toxic because my mother was traumatized and she had a, a really, really bad life. I can't really go into it's not my story to tell, but she, has been through so much more than anybody should ever have to go through. Now, that does not excuse her for being a poor parent, but she did not deal with her shit before she had kids. She did not even attempt to deal with her shit, I think, until recently. And she's nearly 60. So, I dealt with my shit, and I'm still dealing with my shit, so that I don't accidentally traumatize my son.
Yeah,
And that can apply to the wider world, in terms of dealing with all kinds of life situations.
I agree with that. Well, and I think that really still stems back to what we were talking about earlier about the fact that there are so many different levels of trauma that have happened for everybody, dealing with these effects. And being able to recognize that as we're talking to people, being able to recognize that, um, you know, uh, comparing isn't the way to go. Absolutely talk about different experiences and, oh, you experienced that, we experience this too, so that we can see the similarities, and things like that. But trying to play Olympics with it is never the best way to go. And I
Way is really, really important. So as a neurodivergent person, it's so easy for me to go straight in with a comparative of I've been through this kind of thing too, because that is a neurodivergent response. But going into somebody's TikTok when they're talking about their trauma, particularly to do with, say, their indigeneity, and then trying to compare it to something that is outside of that space, that can be seen as trying to talk over.
yeah,
And that is something I have to work on, and I have to take a step back on and say this is not the best way to approach it. Sometimes those kinds of words, although they might to me be building relationships and compassion and stuff, they may not be received well, because it may be received as, with me being a white person, talking over a person of color or an Indigenous person. And, it has happened. I'm not perfect, and I've had to educate myself and take a step back in those moments and understand that me asking a simple neurodivergent question of why can be seen as a demand for labor that is not mine to make,
right.
and B, as I don't believe you type kind of, and that's not the way I've ever intended it. It's just a case of I like to understand and I like to comprehend, and asking the whys is always been important to me. But trying not to tread on other people's spaces and allow them spaces to speak on their things. And if I need to speak on my things, I should create that space or come into welcoming spaces for those things.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's important. I think that sometimes that's hard for me to recognize though too. So I think that that's very true. I think that it makes a lot of sense. that it can be seen completely differently than the, commiseration you're intending, or something like that, or more information. Um, Especially in a community, like I've had people like where I'm getting troll after troll after troll on a video, and then somebody makes a comment that's just like the rest of the trolls, and I'm like, yeah, fuck off, troll. And they're like, I was, really trying to ask, So I think that's especially important when we're looking at it from a online standpoint, that there could be different feelings, or different ways that it's coming across. Um,
It's like TikTok's comments are not very long and don't get a chance to eloquently put your point across, and it takes a lot of effort to write several messages, and then you realize that most people probably won't read all those messages, and they might get halfway through your comment and totally read the wrong thing into it.
yeah,
So
that's real. Yeah, I think all of those things are important when we're recognizing that issues are broader than just our own space, right? That when we're looking at the fact that a lot of, and that's not to monolithicize people globally, but that a lot of people around the globe are dealing with so many different issues within their space, right? Um, and when we're coming together in space like TikTok, that there's so many people that for the first time are getting an understanding that there are different ideas out there, right? uh, you know, making the distinction earlier, and I didn't hear that distinction until Fable had made it, who is Norwegian. But the difference between indigenous and native existing outside of the US, right? And there not being really something that's different here in the US, or in the Americas.
here in native here in the UK, I'm not entirely sure it falls into that category, because technically, like, the Cymry are not considered indigenous by the UN standards, but we are considered native. But we didn't come into the situation at the same time as the English. We were here way, way before. And we had our own governments here before the English, although they weren't on a grand uniting scale. We were still living in tribal kind of communities. So yeah, it's hard to say whether it falls directly into the same kind of definition that Fable was giving. But yeah, understanding that things can definitely mean things in different geographical areas as well. The experience inside the US with regard to racism is going to be very different to the experience of people in, say, I don't know, China. There's different types of racism there because the demographics are different, and therefore it's responded to differently. Opening your eyes and figuring out that, oh my God, there's places that exist outside of the country I live in. TikTok's been great for that. I've learned a huge amount since I've been on TikTok, and I've only been on TikTok probably about 18 months or so. So yeah, I think TikTok is an incredibly informative on one hand, but it also can be quite detrimental on other hands, in terms of too much false information, too much in-house fighting, and sometimes you have to remember that when you wake up and walk out the door, it's not TikTok land, it is reality.
Let it go. Let that shit go.
The amount of, say, transphobic individuals you come across on TikTok, and the debate around the trans issues at the moment, in reality, when you walk out the door in the morning, how is it really going to affect your life? Unless you're trans, it doesn't really affect your life. Good people I am friends with have become quite irate and stressed over these issues. And I said to them, how many trans people do you actually know in real life? Why are you so concerned with this? Why are you so concerned with who's going to be sharing a changing room with you? Because the reality is, even of the 1% of people that identify as trans, the majority of them do not identify as an athlete. You know, the proportion of athletes amongst trans people is much lower than the general population. So you'd be very rare to come across somebody who is going to be competing on an athletic level. We are talking about a very, very few people that just want to exist, you know, and be happy in their existence. Why are we worried?
Right. Well, and I mean, God, of all the things to worry about out there, right? So I need to answer your question in here. Speaks truth. The outside of the United States, there's a difference in the way Native and Indigenous is identified by like the UN and the EU, things like that. To be Indigenous is to fit the things on the list behind me. This is who the UN considers to be Indigenous peoples. And to be Native, you can have been in the same space for the same amount of time as another group, but founding a country that has the majority population, where you're the majority population and you are the ruling class within that space or the rulers within that space, it's your ideology that rules, is Native. So the example given earlier and one that I've heard is like with the Sami and the Swedish. The Swedes arrive in like the lower part of Scandinavia, and the Sami arrive in the Arctic parts roughly the same time period. 7,000 years ago is when they say two groups came in. And by the time we get to Sweden founding a nation, Sweden has kind of pushed the Sami out of their territory in ways, and they're also in some ways not intermixed as in all living together, but like in the same space. They found a government to become a kingdom, and they are the majority of the people, like 51% of the population, and so they are native to that space. Whereas the Sami are the indigenous to that space. Here in the U.S., they're kind of the same thing. And a lot of that is because we don't have anybody who's native here that's not also indigenous to here, right? Because the ones who are occupying are not from this land at all. So, well, and for me, I feel like, and I mean, I think, of course, always you guys should make your own determination. But I think that you fit everything on the list. Like from the things that we've talked about and the conversations that we've had when it comes to the community, I feel like you guys fit everything on the list that the UN acknowledges, right?
Absolutely. I believe that we do. I think the only thing that maybe is holding it back is maybe that it's considered or consciously considered that our culture is watered down or highly watered down from our ancient ancestors. Now, my loose understanding of other indigenous cultures and cultures in general, they do morph and change over time. You know, as has been a mixture. A lot of forcible changes. You know, the initial invasions of the Romans. You know, they slaughtered 1 million Celtic people, and they enslaved another 1 million Celtic people, which, in relative to the populations at the time, was a huge thing. You know, it was a massive thing. You know, they obviously victimized our druids and our religious, people. And the druids weren't just religious people. That's a common misconception. They were the lawmakers, they were the teachers, they were everything to our communities. You know, so they were targeted, and what of them remained went into the undergrounds. There are a few small links to those kind of times. But after the initial onslaught of that, bearing in mind this majoritively affected what is now called England. Um, England used to be Celtic. It used to be completely covered by Cymric people, the same as my people. We spanned all across that part of the land. But they didn't cease to exist in that time. After the initial violence, there was a level of peace, I guess. Not peace itself, there was still fighting, rioting, pillaging, all that kind of stuff. but the Celtic people were allowed to live alongside the Roman occupiers. So they each had their own allotments of and space. That you had your Roman camps, you had your Celtic tribes, and they existed alongside each other, and the Celtic cultures were still alive. And during this kind of time, you can absolutely see a sharing of culture, because there are influences on the Celtic cultures and the Cymry culture that exist because of Rome. But you can also see some, like the Romans adopted one of our deities into their pantheon. So it was a cross sharing. And since that time, Cymru has always been bilingual. They learned to speak the Roman languages so that they could trade and share. So there is a mixture of forced assimilation to a certain degree, things being forced upon us, but also a sharing of culture, which leads to natural kind of evolution in culture. And this happened before the Romans ever existed. Talking about where we come from, yes, we come from Europeans, but we also have genetic makeup from like the Anatolian farmers and the Western hunter-gatherers, like nomads and stuff like that.
Sorry, I was trying to also get the food in, but he's got it going for another 2 hours, so I think I'll wait. I can hear you. My phone doesn't like to let anybody hear me in my house.
So, we've always had, a sharing of cultures, which is how our culture started in the first place, was through the unification of different cultures that then coalesced and settled on this land. So to deny the indigeneity just because we've had our culture watered down since, it first started, that seems a little bit of an unfair argument.
I agree.
Because all cultures have had admixture added to them and evolved naturally and morphed naturally over time. To me, it's as silly as saying, well, Indigenous people of America can't be Indigenous because they're happy using mobile phones. It's a stupid argument. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody needs. Well, I can't make that broad argument.
I want you to continue talking, but I have to run outside really quick, so this may pause me, but I can still hear you. I'm just letting you know. But please don't stop, because I need you to continue. Okay. Apologies. Can you? Nope, you can't hear me. I muted myself, didn't I? No, no, no. Okay, okay. Apologies. I got asked to do something and I had to run outside in the rain to do it. So, um, uh, the last that we were talking about before it went all spotty for me was the well, and I even spoke and I can't think on top of my head.
Not stagnant.
Stagnant, yes. I think that expecting stagnation out of anybody is absolutely ridiculous. Nothing is stagnant. And to think that any of us were stagnant at any point of time ignores all evidence to the contrary. And it really ignores one of the things that we take our most pride on as a species is the ability to really like develop new things, right?
And this is why I think, like it's perfectly acceptable, although a lot of our modern cultural traditions, they are born out of, say, oh, you're paused again.
I'm here. My dog is whining at me.
Yeah, a lot of our modern traditions and stuff, are born out of say Christian traditions and stuff. Um, they're still universally celebrated, even by those that aren't practicing Christians, because they are part of our cultural identity and they have very loose connections to Christianity anyway. But also, the majority of our traditions have roots within the ancient traditions. They might have changed and evolved over the years, but they originate somewhere. And with the majority of things we know from like things being bastardized by Christianity, um, that you know they have, even if we don't know exactly what the connection is, there is some connection there. So we have like a yearly I can't even pronounce it, but it's like a yearly kind of celebration of poetry and music that is all Welsh, where people get all dressed up in pomp and gear and very elaborate robes, and it's a huge thing, and even our schools participate in it. So it's wholly part of Cymru culture. And even things like Nos Galan Gaeaf, which is like our Halloween. um, we have very specific aspects which we don't always know exactly where they trace back to, but they still exist. And we know that a lot of our stuff has been influenced by the cultures that have come in and changed us and whatever. We still celebrate them because they're part of who we are.
And I think that that's important as well. Like when you're talking about, the changes that are being made is different, different spaces is coming in. Um, so my memory is about with the first colonization with the Romans that they conquered pretty much where England itself is now. Um, but the Cymry and the Kenwick and the Picts were kind of the ones that were able to hold out, correct? And weren't really colonized.
Correct. We weren't. So when I say that the Romans came in and they slaughtered Celtic people, I try and make sure that people have to understand that they were Cymric people, which were very much part of our people, but they resided in the place that is now considered England. So although they were our people, and they were on our land was reduced to where Cymru is now. So yes, Cymru itself was relatively untouched. We do have some Roman settlements on like the borders, and Cymru was relatively itself untouched, but the entirety of the Cymric culture as a whole was largely changed.
And that makes sense. That makes sense.
And with the Picts, this is something that I try and again make sure people understand. You get a lot of people saying, "Oh, but the Romans never conquered Scotland." Scotland didn't exist at the time. The Scots didn't get into Scotland until I think 400 or 500s. They were the Gaels that came over from Ireland. The people that existed in what is now called Scotland, which was called like Pictland or whatever then, were the Picts. Now, do the Scottish people have, ancestry with the Picts? Absolutely, because the Picts and Scots eventually, after hundreds of years of infighting, joined together to fight the Anglo-Saxons. That's how Scotland, the land, was created. Did the Romans never conquer the Picts? That's not strictly true either. They did at around, I think their first conquest was about 80 CE, but around about the turn of like 100th, first century or whatever it was, they did actually beat the Picts, but the Picts fought back very quickly, and the Romans got very scared and built Hadrian's Wall, basically to keep the Picts out of the newly conquered England area. So, but yeah, the Picts themselves were largely unchanged by Roman invasion, and obviously then the Scots came over. The Scots came over at the end of the Roman occupation, and they actually were more involved with arguments with the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes.
That makes sense, Rosie. The comment.
Yeah,
I do not know a whole lot about North Africa in Morocco. I apologize. I know some information, and I know, a few things depending on different time periods, but not about the Roman colonization. I do know that Rome colonized North Africa. But
the only thing I know about Morocco is that they have a very unique genetic makeup in terms of their admixture, which they see more of certain things in that particular area than they do in the rest of the southern African states.
That makes sense. And recently, you guys now have our oldest Homo sapien. Recently, the Jebel, I cannot pronounce it to save my life, and I do not like butchering languages other than English. But it's a site in Morocco, and that's where they found a skeleton a while ago of a Homo sapien, but they recently redated it, and the redating puts it at 300,000 years ago. Yes. So I do know that you guys are the first of us, where the first of us are found so far. But I do not know too much about the Roman colonization.
Say Hebel Ord, or it might be Hebel Ord, depending on what pronunciation the J gives.
Well, and I was in Ancestral last night or the night before, and that's the first time I've probably heard it pronounced and knew that it was correct, because I knew that they were. I know from where they're coming from that that they understand the language enough to be able to say it correctly, and so I tried to listen and tried to gather it, but I can't say that I really got it. But yeah, thank you so much.
I got it right. So it just said that my pronunciation was right.
That's awesome. I think so. Okay, that's not how I wanted to. So we've talked before about, like, for you guys, some stuff you guys do for reconnection, that the Cairnwick, which I'm probably mispronouncing again, is actually has some deeper has more of a hang on that they were able to do. So sometimes you guys get information from that for understanding and things like that, correct?
So the Irish have a better, basically, connection. So the Canuick canals in Cornwall, they are more so. I don't want to use the term lost to culture than us, because that's not true. They still have a very rich culture, rich traditions and stuff, but they are technically part of England. They're not even their own recognised country.
Right.
They used to be called West Wales, I think, when the Anglos came in. But they were obviously, again, Cymric people. They were segregated because of the Romans and the Angles, and that's where their language developed and their culture developed separately through the isolation. So the Irish, they have that out of all the Celtic cultures in the UK, I'm not going to say in general because there are Celtic cultures that do exist outside the UK, which I know very little of. Um, they held on to their culture much better than we did. And that's more to do with the fact that they are an island in their own right. To actually colonize them, you have to get a boat. It was much, much more effort. There were less Anglos that went over there, less Romans that went over there, etc. That's not to say that they were untouched. They suffered their own traumas, and you understand, like the potato famine and all that kind of stuff that happened over, well, certainly in the more modern times, and even up until I think it was the 1920s, they finally got their independence. The Republic of Ireland did. And they went from being, I think, one of the poorest countries in the EU to one of the richest. So, but because they were less touched, they managed to hold on to a lot more of their things. And to say that the Celts never wrote anything down, that's not strictly true. It's just that a lot of the stuff was destroyed by the Romans, but also destroyed by the Druids themselves, because knowledge is power. We'd rather this knowledge be destroyed and live on in the brains of people than somebody else have our knowledge. But there is supposedly many, many Irish scriptures written in Old Irish that contain a lot of information about the Celts, probably a lot to do with Ireland, but as Ireland and Wales are so close, and there is a lot of overlapping stories. The Welsh do absolutely appear in their mythologies, and the Irish appear in our mythologies, all that kind of thing. It could really be a chance to unlock some more information that we just don't understand because that information was lost. The problem with that is that it is written in Old Irish, which very few people study and read. And what actually causes a lot of the delays with things like that, believe it or not, is when, say, for instance, Ogham was, or Ogham, however it's pronounced, was kind of discovered or theorized about. Have you ever heard of Celtic tree mythology or Celtic tree astrology or whatever it is?
Yeah.
So the person that created that and attributed each of the letters to different trees, different things, and a wheel of the year type thing. He gained a lot of traction with that because his father was actually the leading expert in Ogham, and therefore people just assumed he knew what he was talking about. So when he came up with that, people stopped studying and people stopped trying because they thought, oh, okay, the mystery's been solved. So that probably set back the study just of Ogham for 40 years, probably more, because people just jumped on this idea of, wow, the Celts had their own astrology. And it's not to say that we didn't, it's just it wasn't attached to Ogham, and certainly not in the way that, he put forward. So, but yeah, there's a lot of manuscripts and things that haven't been deciphered, and who knows what kind of information it holds. I would absolutely love for somebody to be able to go and translate and work on it, but that kind of study takes decades. You not only have to study the language, you then have to study the context of when the language was written, and therefore create some kind of theory or hypothesis of the interpretation of such thing. And then probably go back and forth for years arguing amongst each other about what you think it means and trying to prove it and all that kind of stuff, which is generally what happens in those circles.
I actually, when I was 18, 19, I started that's one thing that I had worked with Celtic mythos and Celtic language and stuff like that. That was my first love, actually, outside of my and I knew that I had heritage there, but outside of the heritage that we have within the United States, right? Um, so I really put a lot into it, and it is. I mean, because like I've sat and I've read the Fignanin, and I've gone through like I remember when that came out, and like I know which OM letters are supposed to represent which trees, and what gods are associated with which OM letters that represent each tree, and things like that. And there is, and that's where I got the name Widda from, is just in-depth study of the language and stuff like that. And so I really, it's a lot, a lot, a lot. I was wondering because we were talking about, culture that had been morphed over time. Like if you can see within that different things that you're like, oh, okay, so that is old, old, old to back to when it was all of us together. And that one's obviously from the Romans, from things like that. Have you
So
guys
there are
been able
some
to go through
things
that?
that are extremely obvious, and then there are other things that are, always have a question mark hanging over them. And for me, I spend a lot of time trying to decipher what is modern tradition, what is medieval tradition, and what is ancient tradition. And with everything, you can probably attribute at least a small fraction to ancient tradition. Because if it was purely Roman, or purely Anglo, or purely Norman, it would be represented elsewhere in the world, in those places. You would see the exact same iteration in the Anglo regions or the Roman regions, but you don't, which tells me logically it has to be an amalgamation of a Roman thing or an Anglo thing mixed with the culture that was already here. And that's just a logical leap that I have no way of proving, and many of us have no way of proving. Now, we do have some oral stories, but again, they don't hold up to Western history and Western science, and it is very difficult to get people to take these kinds of things seriously, and we just have to hold on to what we know in ourselves and what we believe. So for instance, the Irish have told stories for years about how they came from Iberia, and we're only now just starting to see traits of this within genetics and within cultural and linguistics as well. You're seeing the traits in the linguistics, and I find that fascinating. So my hope is that someday history and science will catch up with some of the stories that we do know. The other thing we come up against is we do have people who carry this knowledge and these oral traditions and whatever. A lot of personal practices are just that, and they're carried down through families. There is no way I, as somebody outside somebody's family, could ever turn around and say to them, your practices are not ancient, because I do not know this. For all I know, it might be. But one of the issues we come up against is often the people that say they know stuff don't know stuff. And often the people that do know stuff don't say they know stuff. And that is, again, down to the very old tradition of knowledge is power. And that is one of the things that we can know for sure, about the ancient Druids is, they believed in the power of knowledge, and they understood the environment, and they understood the phases of the moon, and, they observed the seasons. We know this, and like very many other indigenous cultures around the world, they would have utilized and worked with the environment around them to benefit the environment themselves as a community. So when it comes to my personal practices, I take what I know and I use modern science and modern knowledge and modern understanding of the world to apply some of that to create my own practices, which I believe very much are based in ancient knowledge, i.e., for instance, medicinal plants. We know from studying other indigenous groups that they would have had medicines based on the plants that were indigenous to their surroundings. So for me, that is studying what plants were indigenous to my surroundings and understanding the usage of those plants. And therefore, that to me is as good as saying my ancestors would have known this.
I think that that's very real. I think that we've talked before. I've talked before about the fact that pretty much most cultures that I've seen, ancient cultures had some form of a smoke cleansing, right? And so it's perfectly acceptable to smoke cleanse. Um, Try finding the herbs that are native to the area that your ancestors were from. So like smoke cleansing with Turtle Island indigenous herbs that are Turtle Island indigenous, space only, and your ancestors aren't from here, your ancestors are not smelling what you're putting out. And so I think that the same thing works with medicines and things like that. Um, in things that we know that there was something there, like don't take that on any level to not to you, obviously, but don't have anybody else take that on any level to mean like, oh, they had tattoos, so we can take indigenous tattoos and put them wherever we want them, kind of thing, right? Um, but I think that we can absolutely see that, indigenous cultures or ancient cultures or animistic cultures use medicine in so many different spaces and herbology in so many different spaces that you can absolutely see where that translates and that understanding. Um, and I really love, and you mentioned it earlier, and it kind of doubles down in what you were just saying, like for me, understanding language was huge, right? For me, understanding what ancient language worked with was huge, was because of the fact, like, I could understand better what the Druid and the Widda were, right? So Widda, for those who are new to my space and who might not know, is the oldest etymology of the word witch. It is from Proto-Indo-European or the trace back, but came within the Celtic culture and it or within the Celtic nation or when the language becomes Celtic. Um, and Wid means knowledge and Da means feminine. And this is the feminine of the Druid, which means Drew means knowledge and or Drew means oak and Wid means knowledge. And these were the scientists, they were the educated class of the Celts. They were those who gave the laws. They were those who, gave the knowledge. They were those who taught. They were those who studied medicine. Um, and that connection is something that you can understand is there and see in the language used for it how that connection might have been understood. And with that, to me, you can retrace and pull up. Um, but it's very important to acknowledge that the Celts had an educated class that was like their scientists, that was their medics, that isn't, the wild druids running between the front lines between the Celts and the Romans with their wild hair and their black robes, but actually, what I'm sure happened as well, but actually is, the those who healed and those who tended. And when we talk about things like, the Celts actually having written language and writing things down, and the Druids, knowing that knowledge is power, destroying some of that or destroying as much of that as they could, or however that plays out. Very much to me, that's close practice. Like that's an indication of, this is ours. This is you can't have this knowledge, that's huge in that showing of, that very indigenous connection to the space around them, very sense of indigenous connection to the space around them.
There are absolutely aspects of culture that are closed, and it usually falls down to, like I've touched upon, personal practices. Those of us that do practice, I'm going to use the term the old ways because people describe themselves in different ways. Some people were happy to describe themselves as pagans. Some people will happily say that they practice witchcraft or use all these terms that pretty much are modern terms. Those kind of practices generally are closed, and they're generally closed to family groups. I wouldn't walk into a family and say, hey, can I join you for your rituals or whatever, because that would be very rude. And although there are groups that do meet and practice stuff together, I would say the overwhelming majority of them follow more modern day iterations. For instance, shamanism or drumming circles and things like that. And it's not, for me, a connected thing. For me, and I'm going to be very important. Some people find a huge amount of connection in those things. And a lot of people who practice are solitary practitioners because it comes from their knowledge and from their traditions. Now, I never had any family traditions and stuff passed down to me because, well, my father was born in Cornwall to start with, but I grew up in England. You know, I was the first generation in my family ever to be born in a not Celtic place. You know, and I've traced my family back to, like, I think 1595 so far. So, you know, it's been, I kind of feel like there's a slight sense of loss there for me because those practices were not passed down my family lines. But I also don't define myself as any less worthy or Cymru or anything because I am connected. You know, I am learning. I mean, I've been studying my heritage and my culture through pure interest from a very young age. If you go back to like the Roman times, I would technically be experienced and knowledgeable enough to be classed as a druid because I've studied for so long. You know, they had their different levels. You know, you basically had to study for roughly 21 years, I think it was. 7 years to become a bard, which was the poets and the musicians, and then another 7 years to become an opate, which were those that read into the future and, you know, predicted things and all that kind of stuff, and another further 7 years to be like the top end of those things. But they were very much the center of our societies. Yes, we had tribal leaders and native princes and stuff, depending on what age and era you're looking at. But they would have very much looked to their druids for advice and stuff like that. So, yeah, there are aspects that are definitely closed, but the culture itself, when we're talking just pure culture, not ritualistic practices, which is not inherently part of the culture anymore, in terms of just because you say you're Cymru doesn't mean that you have to practice like the old ways. You can be Christian, you can be any religion. We are very multi-denominational, you know, we're not even, in terms of being classed as a Christian nation, we're not even denominational in that. We never have been. You know, we've always been an open practice, you know, believe what you believe, you know, worship how you want to worship kind of place. The culture itself is very much open. Even if you want to talk in terms of Celtic paganism, that is a very open practice because most of that is, yes, based on our deities and our like pantheon structure and stuff like that. And there will be aspects, but a lot of it will be more modern iteration as compared to ancient ways because, let's face it, we don't know definitively everything that happened in our ancient times because a lot of that knowledge was lost. So, yeah, our culture is very open, but the connection is the most important thing. I mean, even genetics is not important to us at all. We have people that live in Wales that don't have a single drop of Celtic blood. In fact, I would bet anything there are people that live in England that have more Celtic blood than I do. Why? Because just because the Anglos took over does not mean that the Celtic genetics just disappeared.
Absolutely.
You know, the overwhelming majority of the entirety of Europe is made up from the same three groups of ancient peoples, like the Western hunter-gatherers, the Indo-Europeans, and the Anatolian farmers.
Right.
It's just made up to different degrees. You know, and that's kind of like how they try and break down your genetics when they do an awful lot of maths, basically, to figure out what possibly could make up who you were. But yeah, there are definitely people in England that have a higher degree of Celtic DNA than I do. That is not the important thing. Culture is not synonymous with DNA. It is a culture, and it is an ecosystem, and it crosses boundaries with politics and economy and all those things. It's not one definitive.
Absolutely.
You don't have to fill or tick every single box to be part of something.
Absolutely.
You're on mute.
Of course I am. Absolutely. Well, and I was not trying to state that Celtic was close practice. Just to clarify for anybody else, what I was trying to state was the Druids burning everything to keep it from the Romans was like early close practice. Like fuck that bitch, you know. Like, but yeah. Well, and I think that that's a really important thing to hear and acknowledge too. Is that it's more about connection, and I know that for many groups, it is so much more about connection than it is about, I mean, ancestry plays a part in many groups. I think, though, that connection plays more of an important part than ancestry. And that doesn't necessarily mean like connected, like, who accepts you here, or who claims you here. But, connected as in, doing one's best to uplift one's culture and doing one's best to connect to one's culture and one's ancestry or the culture of the space that they're in. And so I think that that's really important across those that I've known of, is that connection is huge, and does matter in most ways. I think matters more than DNA. Just because I think that you can absolutely be connected and not have DNA. I mean, there's plenty of different groups that have adopted people into them constantly, so.
Even if you look at the Turtle Island, I know that there is an aspect of a single drop of Indigenous blood, that can make you Indigenous as long as you're connecting. But there are absolutely going to be people outside of Indigenous connection that maybe have more than a drop of blood,
Yeah.
but they're not connected and therefore are not part of those cultures. It's not up to me to define any other group and what they accept as being Indigenous or anything like that. But whatever rules you have set in place, you're always going to find somebody, again, with more DNA or genetic connection to a group that may not be connected to the culture. And again, it just proves that connection is absolutely more important.
I agree with that. Well, and I think that in base root, most Indigenous spaces have that kind of connection in their base root anyways, like that connection to the land around them, right? That's a hugely, and I don't want to say, I mean, most is, I don't even like saying most, but those that I have seen, many of them have that connection to the land is that paramount, right? And connection to others is paramount. So therefore, to me, that makes sense that it's an important denominator in how you claim, or if you claim, or what you claim, because if it's important to many groups, then it's important to anybody trying to be a part of any of those groups, right? And so I think that that's huge. I do want to remind everybody that today we're talking about Indigenous people, people seeking recognition for indigeneity as well outside of the Americas, and that everybody is welcome to come up and speak on their experience with that, and what is important about it for them today. I don't normally do panel lives, but I am trying to make sure that we have some space for different groups of people to speak. I am probably going to take off in probably half an hour, just to let everybody know as well. But
that's okay for me, because it's like 1:45 in the morning here.
Well, and you can take off if you need to, sweetheart. You don't have to stay up for us. We love you doing so. But
tired. I have ADHD. What makes you think I'm tired?
I haven't been going to sleep until 3 o'clock in the morning myself. I feel that way too much.
Yeah. The downside is I've got to be up at 7. Somebody's got to go to school.
Well, yeah. I think that when we look at how far back, in different spaces around the globe that colonization goes, we can see, so many different spaces where culture has been morphed, or maybe stamped out, or maybe held in different ways, or things like that. And that recognizing those things is important. I do want to double down and make sure that we understand and know that, when we're talking about Indigenous groups currently, we want to make sure that we're talking about not, like my Germanic ancestors were absolutely Germanic indigenous to Germanic indigenous spaces, but there are not Germanic indigenous people in Germanic indigenous spaces currently, either fighting for recognition that I know of. And if there are, I would love to find out, or, recognized at this point. So we must make sure that when we're looking at it, we're looking at, you can find your own indigenous ancestry and your own indigenous, way to connect to your ancestors. But uh, as happens all too often in social media spaces, going around deciding that you then get to decide what's open and closed practice, or that certain groups are indigenous that no longer, exist or would be considered indigenous in the first place, or things like that, is not appropriate either, because it devalues the struggle that many places are going through, either to be recognized or to have sovereignty in places that they're already recognized as indigenous. Um, and the struggle of those groups across the globe is an extremely important and extremely real struggle that we have to all work together to recognize and ensure that more people understand. But again, today's live is open to those who are indigenous of spaces outside the Turtle Islands or outside of North and South America, so that we can have a broader understanding of what this looks like for everybody across the globe, what this resilience looks like for everybody across the globe, what resilience looks like for people across the globe.
So the only other thing I would add is it's a pet peeve of mine. I go almost to the point of seeing red when somebody who has ancestry to, say, Cymru or Cymric culture, but is not connected, and then uses that small connection to justify harming another culture, saying it's okay because I'm Celtic, or it's okay. And we've seen a lot of it happening with, say, mostly with Viking and Nordic cultures trying to use, tattooing on their chins and stuff like that. But I have seen it happen with Celtic, people claiming Celtic identity as well. So if I come up in your space and turn around and say, so which Celtic, what is your Celtic connection? Which Celtic nation are you? It's because I hate people just using the term Celtic as well. We're not a homogenous group. We have got all of our own unique identities, and claiming that you're Celtic and that's okay to go out and do something that's going to cause somebody else harm when you have no understanding of what it means to be Celtic in the first place really grind my goat.
Well, and I think that it's important to recognize the damage that does. It's important to recognize that it's okay for you to have Irish ancestry and to try and reconnect to your Irish, ancestry. Um, at no point is reconnecting to your Irish ancestry ever supposed to make or give you permission to, or cause a reason for you to uphold white supremacy, or uphold actions that are hateful or rude or diminishing or devaluing of other human beings. And just because you have ancestry to something, say again, Irish ancestry, it does not make me Irish. I'd have to live in Ireland and be a citizen of Ireland to be Irish. Having ancestry to a space, again, I want to reiterate, if you've got a drop of Indigenous blood in Turtle Islands, you are Indigenous. Reconnection is huge and important. Uh, Yet, even with that, you need to make sure that you're not deciding that you are something and therefore you get to degrade anybody else or devalue anybody else, or deciding that you are something And therefore you get to speak over people about it, and to always remember that just because your ancestry is something doesn't mean that you have the connection that your ancestors would have insisted that you have to be them, to call yourself that, and that it is important to not say be over here in this diaspora and be Celtic and decide that, because I have Celtic indigeneity, that means that I get to speak over or talk over or anything else. Um, it's absolutely okay to see yourself as such. It's absolutely okay to work for your own personal knowledge. It's absolutely okay to understand your own ancestral connection. It should never make you feel that you are an authority over other people just because you have ancestry somewhere.
I mean, right, so I live in Cymru. I have, my great-grandfather on my mother's side was Scottish. So I have Scottish heritage. And I live super close to Scotland. In comparative to global, kind of, it still take me a long time to get there, but it probably take me less time to get there than most people would take to get from one state to another, in terms of that kind of distance. I can drive from one end of the country to the other in less than 16 hours, I think, and that's tip to tip, and that's like the long way round. But I still don't get to talk on Scottish politics or Scottish culture or Scottish identity. I talk, if I do, from an academic historical aspect, my understanding of the Picts and the Gaels and the history. But I will never speak with a huge amount of emotion over the top of it. I can obviously have my own personal feelings. Yes, absolutely. But I do not have a broad understanding of the current culture, the current politics, or anything that goes on in there. Now, most Cymru people will absolutely call the Scottish people their siblings. We're with you on your own independence fight. We will uphold them and uplift them in any way we can. But I'm generally always very careful, and I will say, I'm with the Scottish people, and it basically means I am giving the Scottish people their right to democracy, because they have their own voice, and I appreciate that not all Scottish people want independence. Not all Scottish people want to stay part of the union. I understand that. It's not my not my place to tell the Scottish people what they should want. That's just simply how it is, and I am so close to Scotland. So, yeah, I mean, Scotland is one of the other places that I have been to. I absolutely love Scotland. Its culture, its identity, and it's one of those few places that I can walk into and think, I feel like it's not quite the same as Cymru for me. It's not quite the same as Newark for me, but my connection to my ancestors, part of maybe them shining through me in some way. But yeah, it's an amazing place to be.
I hope you can hear me. I had to move back. Yeah, and I think that that's important. I mean, I think that everybody, no matter where you're at, has space to be allies to people, anyways, right? We all have space to uplift other people's, needs and other people's just trying to survive. So recognizing that I can uplift somebody else's needs without claiming to be a part of them and speak over them, I think can be extremely huge, right? Like I can uplift any culture and even have ancestry in that culture without having to claim that culture and speak over that culture. We'll have to do it at the same time, Rosie. I'll sleep on the floor. I'll bring a bedroll.
I have an awesome sofa. It does recline. And even if you did come to Cymru, it again is not that difficult to get to Scotland from here. You could hire a car and drive there in probably less than 4 hours.
I want to do the Eurorail.
Eurorail?
Yeah, you can like fly into Copenhagen from Portland, Oregon, and fly in and round trip Copenhagen for $400. And then the Eurorail, you can spend. It used to be $1,000 on a ticket and get a month-long ticket. So you get like you could basically live on the train for a month. And the Eurorail goes from like Copenhagen to Venice, and then goes out to England, or like drops at a ferry. I can't remember if it goes all the way. I think it actually goes all the way out. Like they must ferry drop you out there. That's when it would be. Okay, yeah. And then over into, I think it seems like a cutoff line above the Italian peninsula. So like from the Italian peninsula up through Eurasia seems to be the cutoff line for the Eurorail when I was looking at it. But I'm like, I want to fly to Copenhagen round trip and then grab a month-long plane or train ticket and just train all over fucking, Western Europe and see what it looks like. And bye, Speaks Truth. Have a great one.
I haven't explored Europe enough, and I live in Europe. I have done a fair bit of traveling. I've been to, in Europe, I've been to France, which was for fishing because I didn't really get to do much in France. I really wanted to go to Paris, but, toxic ex didn't want to. So we did go to Mont Saint Michel, which is a really old medieval kind of place. It used to be cut off by the tide and stuff like that, which is really awesome. And I've done Spain, which I did when I was 18. Haven't been back since. And I've done Austria twice. Austria's amazing. But that, I think, is it. I've been to Cyprus. But then outside of that, I've been to India. I've been to Egypt. And I've been to Miami. Miami's not that great. And I'm sorry if there's anybody from Miami here, but I didn't find it that great. So, but
I've heard that. I've heard that it's not that great.
If you want to sit on a beach all day, fine. If you want to go to the nightclubs, fine. If you want to go and shoot a gun, which is a really strange thing for somebody who comes from a country that doesn't have access to guns, fine, you can go and do that. But aside from that, there's not a huge amount of stuff I found to do that was interesting. But I'm the type of person that likes to go and touch grass and look at architecture and, stuff like that. So, it's a bit of a concrete city for me.
Where was your favorite place?
What, in Miami?
No, in all of them, all you've seen, which one is your favorite so far?
So I loved Austria. I much preferred my second trip to Austria than the first. The first time I went to Austria, you're paused. I don't know if you can still hear me.
I can hear you, absolutely. I can hear you.
You're muted. Okay. So the first time I went to Austria, I went and stayed in what's the name of the place? The capital. Begins with V. Vienna. That's it.
I would not have known.
And
I would not have known that.
Yeah, amazing architecture, all that kind of stuff. A lot of amazing music, and brilliant. But the second time we went, we stayed outside of Vienna. We stayed at a place called Lake Attersee. So we actually. The reason we went to Austria in the first place, because when we were in Miami, we actually met a couple who were staying in the same motel as us, who were from Vienna. So we actually went over the following year to see them, and the year after we went back again to see them. So yeah, Lake Attersee is like, I don't know if it's the largest in Europe, certainly the largest in Austria, largest lake. It's like, I think, I might get these numbers wrong, but it's like 3 kilometers wide and 27 kilometers long, and it's like 300 meters deep or something like that. And all this water runs from the glaciers in the mountains. It is so clean that you can not only swim in it, you can also drink it simultaneously. It is also very, very cold, and I was very, very pregnant when I went. So I had major concerns getting in and out of that water because I was worried about spontaneous labor because it was that cold. But that was beautiful. We stayed in a farmhouse, and the breakfasts were amazing because they put out like boiled eggs and bread and meats and stuff. And there was a farm cat that used to come and snuggle around your legs and all kinds of stuff. It was really, really kind of like a really good experience. So that's one of my favorite places. But the other place I went, I loved India. Now, when I went to India, it was, 22, 23, so we're going back quite a little bit of time. I actually went with my ex-girlfriend, which was kind of a little bit of a funny situation because she was living in London, I was living in Northampton. She was studying over here. Her parents were from India and didn't know that she was gay. So she basically went back to India for 6 months to look after her mum because her mum suffered an illness. And because of their traditions and stuff, women were not allowed to travel alone. And they were going to send her brother over to come and collect her and take her back. But then I said, well, why don't I take you? Because, I could be a companion. I obviously knew fully well that we could not be girlfriends while we were out there. Because there was a real fear of getting stoned to death.
Yeah.
In that particular area.
Yeah.
But she was from quite an affluent family. Her father worked offshore, so I actually ended up staying with her and her family for 10 days in Mumbai, which is actually not a very touristy place. I was pretty much, I think, I was one of 2 white people I saw my entire time there, and literally had children following me around in the streets in Hindi, calling me white girl, white girl, white girl, which was awesome. But I spent most of my time in the house, in the kitchen with her servants, watching them cook food and learning how to cook Indian food. But I was out there for 10 days and I struggled to spend £110, and I came back with a whole suitcase full of stuff. It was such an experience. I mean, driving out there, they are either the best or the worst drivers because they have 2 systems in place. On some of the roads you drive on the left, on some of the roads you drive on the right, and there are crossover sections which are fun. I didn't drive at the time, but my ex did, and we were going on an Indian flyway, and she dropped something in the footwell. And she just, without thinking, she just said to me, here, take the wheel for a second, and bent down to get it. We're doing 70 miles an hour on this flyway, and I'm going, oh my God. But yeah, that was an experience. Yeah, I mean, they've got some amazing, I think it cost like the equivalent of £2.10. I worked it out, £2.10, which is probably American, US, less than $3 currently, to get 2 people and a car into a national safari.
What Rosie said.
You're on mute, by the way.
What Rosie said.
Yeah, I almost had a heart attack. It was one heck of an experience. But yeah, I loved India. India's a fantastic place. I mean, you have all different aspects of the culture. They still have their caste system in place. I know that my ex's brother at the time was dating somebody who was considered of a lower caste, and that was causing problems in the family. I didn't understand a huge amount of what was going on because they spoke Hindi, and although I spoke a little bit of Hindi at the time, or at least understood a little bit of Hindi, most of my concentration would have been my ex-girlfriend teaching me the bad words. So I refrained from speaking much of what I knew. Yeah, it was definitely an experience, and I also appreciate that I was probably kept from some of the darker sides of the cultures, And I also appreciate that despite the fact that my ex-girlfriend came from India, she was also colonized in her mindset, because one of the first things she said to me flying into India is don't look at the slums, because the airport, as you go into land, just goes over the slums. She did not want me to see that part of her country because she thought it was a bad thing. And it's like, that's not the way I see it. I see it as something that needs to be seen. So
And I think that that's real. And again, I mean, I would never tell anybody how to do their things, their space. I feel though, for myself though, that I think that the more we see and the more we recognize of the atrocities that have gone across or gone in on in different spaces, um, the more we can recognize the issue of colonization and the more that we can decolonize those spaces and decolonize our thought process. you know you know again, when we talk about you having to face yourself and having to learn and having to grow, a part of learning and growing is facing the things that you may have done or that other people may have done, and how they may affect you and how they may affect other people. And I think that that's huge to see the horrors that have happened as a result is huge, because so many people are able to ignore their existence, ignore that they're happening, ignore that they're still going on, ignore that there's still problems going on around the globe, right? So many people think, oh, well, you know, uh, New Zealand's doing great, so New Zealand must not be having problems for their indigenous people, right? Because they've got a great president right now, so there's so many different spaces that tend to ignore the atrocities going on in other spaces, right?
with India, it's like, first and foremost, I think I read recently there is, it's either 2 or 3 thousand separate ethnic identities within just the space that is India. It is so diverse, so vast. It is a huge country to start with. And if you look at the colonial impact of India, India used to be one of the richest places in the world with regards to resources. And the British went in, took everything, and then when they said, "Oh, you're fighting for independence, fine, we'll leave," and they left them with nothing, and left them in, without a established government or anything. So I can't obviously speak specifically, but that is horrendous. But then, other aspects that I can look at in terms of like money, or okay, they earn very, very little in the day, but that kind of money for the most part, and again, there's going to be people below the poverty line, for the average person is plenty to be able to buy the things that they need. It is like a standard of living, the cost it costs. The thing that is killing the economy, or killing, and this is just my experience, is the cost of housing and land there is actually more expensive than the UK. So you've got people earning like a couple of pounds a day, but are expected to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds just for a small property. It's just not sustainable, And then obviously their population as well in their big cities and stuff. So there are multiple levels of trying to understand a different culture from an outside perspective that we don't often think about, because it's not through our lens, it's not through our experience, you know.
Well, and I think that's a good example of, how to, or, what to, yes, like you were talking about earlier. Yes, I want to be sovereign. And yes, I want to have our own, I want to make sure that it happens in a way that is healthy, right? So, that it's not just the English point pulling out and, we don't have a government and we don't have a this and we don't have a that. That is something that, has happened where, the colonizer has pulled out, the decolonization of the government has happened, but they're still left with issues that maybe were in play before and issues that are in play after the colonization government that are directly related to the colonization government. And then you got people who also don't have a method of I mean, I don't believe government is needed by everyone, right? But a method of communities, of state, a method of being able to take care of each other, or of governance as opposed to government. And so when you leave and you don't leave that behind, what do you enter into then? And so that's, I think, really something to really be aware of, is how this is affected in spaces where the colonizer government has pulled out, what has happened in those spaces, so that in the movements forward, that those the different groups that I know are trying to take, that doesn't repeat itself, that the negativity, the problematic stuff doesn't repeat itself. I think that's an important aspect of understanding the history of what's going on, not only the history of what colonization has happened, but the history of what decolonization has been able to happen, and what that has been like in different spaces. What it's looked like. Has it been even, is it really decolonization sometimes, different things like that.
The Cumbria are very, relatively privileged in the sense of government. We do actually have our own government. We have a devolved government. So this is where the UK government have given our specific government, like the Senate, which is what it's called, certain powers. So we have the power of control over our public spending within Cymru, which includes our healthcare systems and our education systems. It does not cover things like justice and law, criminal law or things like that. So we're still bound to UK law in terms of things like abortion rights. We do not have the powers to change them specifically within our country. Even though technically it should fall under like medical issues, but because it's not, it's actually written into law as a criminal act, it cannot be changed. Although it's been decriminalized, it's still actually illegal here to get an abortion. You're just forgiven if it's under certain circumstances. So yeah, that's something we're actually fighting for at the moment. That's part of the work I'm doing with the Women's Equality Party. But there still begs a question of, yes, we have a government, the Senate, which is used to dealing with basic aspects of governance, but would they be able to deal with a broader range of governance, i.e., if we gave them the powers to change our criminal laws and justice systems, would they be able to cope with that? Would they be able to deal with that? Would they deal with that in the right way? Would the people be happy with how they deal with that? And on top of that, our Senate is still, I should actually know where our Senate is. I'm assuming it's in Cardiff, but I might be wrong on that. We only have I think 5 cities in Cymru. Everywhere else is a town or a village. We don't even have proper motorways here in Cymru. Our infrastructure sucks. But I know that there is a very real fear from a certain amount of people who live in North Wales that if we were to become independent, then the Welsh government would become very much like Westminster is in England. Westminster, which is like the government there, is based in London and pretty much only does things to benefit London. And I know that North Wales, who speak their own dialect, who have their own problems, who have their own issues, are worried that the government could potentially become very South-centric, meaning that they'd be more worried about what happens in the South. And yes, the South has a higher population and is actually more touched by colonization than the North. Bearing in mind, the majority of people in the North speak Welsh fluently and speak Welsh as their first language fluently. We face a different set of issues. And this is a lot of these issues probably could be solved by setting up better infrastructure, i.e., trains and motorways and better roads and stuff, to create a better connection between the North and the South. But yeah, making sure that all these fears are addressed is very important. And there are lots of questions hanging over. In terms of independence, one of the tactics that Westminster use is you'd never survive on your own. You'd be in £13.6 billion worth of debt per year. And although these are numbers, real numbers generated by real things, it does not take into consideration the amount of water that we export to England that we don't get paid for does not take into consideration the amount of money we generate through energy. We're the fifth largest energy supplier in the world, but that at the moment is generated for private corporations and stuff like that. If you were to bring that under public control, the more realistic numbers would be about 2.6 billion. Then there's questions surrounding around what currency we would use, because if we leave the UK, surely we wouldn't be able to use the pound. And economically, from my brain, yes, it would be nice to have our own currency, but for an interim period, absolutely, it should still be a pound, but maybe the Welsh pound or something, very much like Scotland has their own pound, because introducing a new currency that nobody trades in is going to tank the economy. So, there are lots and lots of questions. And honestly, I believe people want these questions answered before they would even decide to vote on independence. But then that comes to a very circular kind of issue of who is going to do these numbers and come up with these kinds of solutions if all of our funds and everything are on a shoestring and nobody can actually has the time or get paid to do these things. It's a very circular kind of issue. We need these answers, but realistically, we can't plan these answers until we leave and have control over our own funds. So, yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense though too. Like, I mean, I get it on a lot of levels. Like, I mean, I've thought about how, because my idea is that, we do have like tribal governments here, our nation governments here. And to me, I feel like we should be returning tending and governance to those groups of people. That's the way I look at it. So I've thought of a bunch of different, how do we get there? How do we get there? It's really hard to make decisions for what something is going to be before it's going to be, right? And who am I to be making decisions for what it's going to be, and so I can totally see that like and I to me that's a very humble space to be, right? Or a very appropriate, I guess. No, but it's a very understanding space to be. Like it's a space that is seeing that it's that you can't make those decisions, or that it takes more than just me to make that plan, things like that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's very hard to make decisions for something that you don't even know what it is yet.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not afraid of admitting that I don't have the answers for everything. But I'm also doesn't mean that I'm going to stop picking holes with the issues that we currently face.
Yeah.
Just because I'm going to play devil's advocate and say this is not working doesn't mean I'm going to give you a solution to it. We should be working together to find that solution, and more than my voice should be part of that. It should be a collective. Because only together, when you bounce ideas off of each other, can you come up with something that is far greater than the one mind trying to find answers.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. All right, so we've been on a little bit longer than I said it was going to be. We're going to go ahead and take off. Let Sleepy get some sleep. Um, and I will see you guys all tomorrow. I'll set up a live event, and it will be focused on Indigenous people here in the Turtle Islands. And the different things that are discussion areas and stuff like that we're dealing with. Thank you everybody for coming in. Have a great one, Rosie. Enjoy the rest of your day. And
Rosie can come up next time.
I'm hoping that would be awesome. I want to try and get more people in here as well. So if you have anybody who you know of who is looking to, or who you think might be up for the labor that it takes to come and speak to people, and is comfortable in doing that, please let me know. And please direct them my way.
Next time she's coming.
Oh, yes.
I'm a witness. Rosie says next time she's coming up.
She did. I'm going to hold her to it. I saw it. Love you all so much. I'll see you guys later. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it is. Okay.